Malcolm Washington stands frozen as flight attendant Heather demands his 16-year-old son Jamal move to economy despite their first-class tickets. Surrounding passengers stare, some smirk, others look uncomfortable. Malcolm calmly makes a phone call that will change everyone's lives forever. Sometimes patience is more powerful than anger. Before I dive into this incredible story, where are you watching from today? Hit that like button and subscribe if you've ever witnessed discrimination or stood up against injustice. The ending of this story will show you why strategic patience might be the most powerful weapon against racism. Malcolm Washington wasn't the type of billionaire who appeared on magazine covers. At 52, the self-made aviation mogul had built his empire through strategic acquisitions and a remarkable eye for undervalued assets. His latest acquisition, Continental Airways, had been finalized just 3 days ago, a deal kept deliberately quiet until the official announcement to staff earlier that morning. Few passengers on Flight 1387 from Boston to Atlanta would have recognized him in his casual attire, faded jeans, navy polo, and Boston Red Sox cap pulled low over his eyes. Malcolm preferred it that way. Throughout his career, anonymity had given him insights that flashy executives missed. "Dad, are you sure we shouldn't have taken the private jet?" Jamal Washington whispered as they settled into their first-class seats. At 16, Jamal was already taller than his father, with the same thoughtful brown eyes and quiet confidence that had helped Malcolm navigate predominantly white business environments. "And miss quality time together on a commercial flight?" "Never," Malcolm replied with a smile. "Besides, I need to experience my new airline as a regular passenger." Jamal nodded, understanding his father's philosophy. Since starting at Westbrook Academy, an elite boarding school in Massachusetts, Jamal had learned to navigate predominantly white spaces with the same strategic patience his father had taught him. "Remember what I always tell you," Malcolm said quietly as he noticed a few sideways glances from other first-class passengers. "Play the long game," Jamal completed the familiar lesson. Short-term reactions might feel good, but long-term strategy wins the war. It was a philosophy Malcolm had developed early in his career when facing discrimination. Instead of immediate confrontation, he'd learned to document patterns, build cases, and create systematic change from positions of power. It had served him well as he climbed from middle management to owning multiple companies. Malcolm had deliberately chosen to dress casually today. He wanted to experience Continental Airways as any other passenger would, not as its new owner. The decision to acquire the airline had come after hearing multiple reports of discriminatory treatment toward minority passengers, particularly in first-class cabins. As they settled into seats 2A and 2B, Malcolm noted the plush leather seats, individual entertainment screens, and premium amenities that characterized Continental's first-class service. The cabin was arranged in a 1-2-1 configuration, providing aisle access for every passenger. Across the aisle in 2C sat Raymond Curtis, a 44-year-old corporate executive in a crisp charcoal suit who acknowledged them with a brief nod before returning to his Wall Street Journal. The other passengers, predominantly white business travelers, were already settling in with pre-flight drinks. Flight attendant Heather Bailey approached their row with practiced efficiency. At 38, she was a 15-year veteran of Continental, having worked her way up from regional routes to the premium transcontinental service. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, uniform pressed to perfection. "Good afternoon," she greeted passengers in 1A and 1B warmly, taking drink orders with a practiced smile. Malcolm observed her interaction with other passengers, noting the subtle differences in her demeanor as she moved through the cabin. When she reached Raymond Curtis, her smile broadened. "Welcome back, Mr. Curtis. Lovely to see you again. Your usual scotch on the rocks?" "You've got it, Heather." "Thank you," Raymond replied, clearly a frequent flyer recognized by the crew. Malcolm watched as Heather's eyes darted briefly to him and Jamal before moving to serve passengers behind them. It was a subtle slight, one most people might not notice, but Malcolm had experienced it too many times to miss. "She skipped us," Jamal whispered, reaching for his backpack to pull out homework. "Let's see if it's intentional or just an oversight," Malcolm replied calmly, making mental notes for what he knew would be an inevitable conversation with Continental's executive team about customer service standards. 20 minutes into the boarding process, with drinks served to everyone else in first class, Malcolm's hypothesis was becoming clear. It wasn't an oversight. Heather had methodically avoided their row while providing attentive service to every other passenger. "This is what we're going to fix," Malcolm murmured to himself as the last passengers filed through to economy class. "Excuse me," Malcolm raised his hand politely as Heather passed by their seats for the third time without acknowledgement. The cabin was now fully boarded, with the main door closed and preparation for departure underway. Heather paused, a momentary flash of something, annoyance, resignation, crossing her face before her professional mask returned. "Yes. How can I help you?" Her tone was noticeably cooler than the one she'd used with other passengers. "We haven't been offered pre-departure drinks," Malcolm said evenly. "My son and I would appreciate some water, if possible." Heather's eyes darted between them, lingering on Jamal's designer hoodie and Malcolm's casual attire. "Of course. I must have overlooked your row. May I see your boarding passes, please?" Malcolm noticed Raymond Curtis glance up from his newspaper, watching the interaction with growing interest. "Certainly," Malcolm replied, retrieving the boarding passes from his pocket despite the fact they had already been checked at the gate and upon boarding the aircraft. He handed them to Heather with a calm smile. Heather examined the documents with unusual scrutiny, turning them over and running her finger along the seat assignments, 2A and 2B, first class. "Is there a problem?" Malcolm asked, already knowing the answer. "No, no problem," Heather replied, though her tone suggested otherwise. "It's just that we've had issues with upgrade confusion recently. Sometimes passengers are accidentally directed to the wrong cabin." "There's no confusion," Malcolm assured her. "We're in our assigned seats." Heather handed back the boarding passes with a tight smile. "I'll bring your water shortly." As she walked away, Jamal leaned toward his father. "She thinks we don't belong here," he whispered. "I know," Malcolm replied softly. "Watch how this unfolds. There's a lesson here." When Heather returned several minutes later, she carried 2 small plastic cups of water, notably different from the glass tumblers provided to other first-class passengers. She set them down without the warm service others had received. "Actually," Malcolm said before she could leave, "I'd like to see the beverage menu, please." A flash of irritation crossed Heather's face. "We're preparing for departure now, sir. I'll have to serve additional beverages once we're airborne." "Everyone else seems to have received their preferred drinks," Malcolm observed calmly, gesturing around the cabin where other passengers were enjoying cocktails, wine, and premium beverages. Raymond Curtis lowered his newspaper slightly, now openly watching the interaction. Heather's posture stiffened. "Your son appears quite young. We have strict policies about serving minors. He's 16, and I'm requesting a ginger ale for him and coffee for myself," Malcolm clarified. "Neither contains alcohol." "I'll see what I can do after takeoff," Heather replied dismissively. "Also, your son might be more comfortable in economy where there are other young people. First class is primarily for business travelers." The implication hung in the air, clear, undeniable, yet carefully worded to maintain plausible deniability. Jamal's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, following his father's example of controlled dignity. Malcolm placed a reassuring hand on his son's arm. "We're perfectly comfortable right here, thank you," Malcolm responded, his voice level but firm. Several nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. An older gentleman in row 3 suddenly became intensely interested in the safety card. A woman across the aisle studied her manicure with unusual concentration. Raymond Curtis, however, reached subtly for his phone and placed it on his tray table, angled toward Malcolm and Jamal. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding," Heather continued. "These premium seats are typically reserved for our frequent flyers and business travelers. I'm simply suggesting your son might prefer economy where the environment is more casual." The coded language was unmistakable, the implication that they didn't meet the profile of typical first-class passengers despite having valid tickets. "There's no misunderstanding," Malcolm replied. "We have purchased first-class tickets and are seated in our assigned seats. My son and I will remain here." Heather's smile tightened. "I'll need to check with my supervisor about this situation. One moment, please." As she walked away, Jamal turned to his father. "Why are you letting her talk to us like that?" "I'm gathering evidence," Malcolm whispered. "Trust the process." Raymond Curtis caught Malcolm's eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod of support. He tapped his phone slightly, indicating he was recording the interaction. Malcolm nodded back in appreciation, recognizing an unexpected ally. 5 minutes later, Heather returned with Brett Coleman, the senior flight attendant. At 42, Brett had the confidence of someone who had handled countless in-flight situations, though the slight furrow in his brow suggested he was less than thrilled to be involved in this particular issue. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Brett began with practiced diplomacy. "I understand there might be some confusion about your seating arrangements." Malcolm maintained his composure. "There's no confusion on our part. My son and I have purchased first-class tickets and are seated accordingly." Brett glanced at Heather, who gave him a subtle nod as if confirming some previous discussion. "May I see your boarding passes, please?" Brett asked. Malcolm noticed the pattern, the repeated verification of their right to occupy these seats despite having already been checked multiple times. Nevertheless, he produced the boarding passes again, handing them to Brett with unwavering calm. Brett examined them with the same unusual scrutiny Heather had shown. "These appear to be in order, but..." "But what?" Malcolm asked, his voice still even. "We've been experiencing some system errors with our booking platform," Brett explained. "Sometimes passengers are incorrectly assigned to cabins." Malcolm checked his watch discreetly. The scheduled departure time had already passed, and they were now delaying the flight. It was all unfolding exactly as he had anticipated. "Is this happening to any other passengers on this flight?" Malcolm inquired, knowing the answer. Brett shifted uncomfortably. "Not that I'm aware of." "Dad," Jamal whispered, his patience wearing thin. "Why aren't we saying something? This is ridiculous." "Trust me, son," Malcolm replied softly. "Timing is everything." By now, the entire first-class cabin was aware of the situation. Some passengers pointedly looked away, while others watched with varying degrees of discomfort or curiosity. Raymond Curtis continued his subtle recording, his newspaper now completely lowered. "Given the circumstances," Brett continued, "we'd like to suggest temporarily moving to available seats in economy while we sort this out. I'm sure you understand we need to prepare for departure." "What circumstances exactly?" Malcolm asked, his tone still measured but more pointed. "Our tickets are valid. Our seats are assigned." "What precisely is the problem?" Heather interjected. "Sir, we're simply trying to ensure everyone is properly accommodated." "Everyone? Or just us?" Malcolm responded. "Because I notice you haven't questioned any other passengers about their seating assignments." Brett attempted to defuse the growing tension. "Sir, I assure you this is standard procedure when there are seating discrepancies." "I'd like to speak with the captain," Malcolm requested calmly. "The captain is preparing for departure and cannot be disturbed," Brett replied quickly. "For the sake of on-time departure, would you and your son please come with us to discuss this outside the cabin?" The humiliation was palpable. Every passenger was watching now, some with sympathy, others with impatience at the delay. "This is our last request," Heather added, her professional demeanor slipping. "If you refuse to cooperate, we may need to involve airport security, which would further delay the flight for everyone." It was the ultimatum Malcolm had been waiting for, the moment when implicit bias escalated to explicit threat. Raymond leaned slightly across the aisle. "This doesn't seem right," he said quietly to Malcolm. "Do you want me to say something?" Malcolm shook his head slightly. "Thank you, but that won't be necessary." Looking at his son's face, the controlled anger, the dignity in the face of humiliation, Malcolm felt a surge of pride mixed with the familiar ache of knowing that, despite his success and wealth, his son still faced the same prejudices he had fought against all his life. "We'll step outside to discuss," Malcolm finally agreed. "But I want to be clear that we are not voluntarily giving up our seats." As they stood to follow Brett and Heather off the aircraft, the true confrontation was only just beginning. "Before I continue with this shocking story, what would you have done in Malcolm's situation? Comment, patience, if you would have stayed calm like him, or confront, if you would have immediately called out the discrimination. And what do you think happens next? Hit that like button if you're ready to see justice served in this situation." The walk down the aisle felt interminable. Malcolm kept his head high, one hand on Jamal's shoulder as they followed Brett and Heather toward the aircraft door. 20 rows of passengers watched their procession, some awkwardly averting their eyes, others staring openly at what appeared to be troublemakers being removed from first class. "Dad," Jamal whispered through clenched teeth, "this is humiliating." "Keep walking," Malcolm replied quietly. "Remember, dignity cannot be taken, only surrendered." As they stepped onto the jet bridge, the aircraft door closed behind them with a definitive thud. The enclosed space felt suddenly claustrophobic, amplifying the tension between the four of them. Brett positioned himself between the Washingtons and the aircraft door, while Heather stood with arms crossed, her expression a mixture of impatience and vindication. "Airport security has been notified," she informed them with barely concealed satisfaction. "They'll escort you to customer service to rebook your flight." Two figures approached from the terminal end of the jet bridge: Karen Mitchell, the ground supervisor, a slim woman in her mid-30s with a Continental Airways blazer and concerned expression, and behind her, Troy Wilson, a 29-year-old black security officer who assessed the situation with professional detachment. "What seems to be the problem?" Karen asked, her tone carefully neutral as she looked between the flight attendants and the Washingtons. "These passengers were causing a disruption," Heather began. "They were argumentative about their seating assignment and refusing to comply with crew instructions." Malcolm remained silent, watching the narrative unfold with calculated patience. "They presented first-class boarding passes," Brett added, "but there appears to be some confusion in the system. We suggested they move to economy while we sorted out, but they became confrontational." Troy's eyes met Malcolm's briefly, a flash of recognition, not of his face, but of the situation itself. The security officer's expression remained professional, but a subtle shift in his posture suggested he was reserving judgment. "I'd like to speak privately with Ms. Mitchell," Malcolm requested calmly. "Whatever you need to say can be said here," Heather interjected. "Actually," Karen corrected her, "I'd prefer to hear Mr. Washington," Malcolm supplied. "Malcolm Washington. And my son, Jamal." "Mr. Washington's perspective directly," Karen finished, with a pointed look at Heather. "Standard protocol for passenger disputes." "May I use my phone briefly before we talk?" Malcolm asked. Karen nodded. "Of course." Malcolm stepped a few paces away and made a brief call. "Diana?" "Malcolm Washington." "Yes, I'm at the airport. Flight 1387 to Atlanta." "Yes, that's the one. Jet Bridge, Gate A17. Thank you." He ended the call and turned back to the group. "We have about 3 minutes." 3 minutes for what?" Heather asked, her confidence wavering slightly. "Dad, what's happening?" Jamal whispered, confused by his father's unusual calmness in the face of such blatant discrimination. "A teaching moment," Malcolm replied. Troy shifted his weight, eyes darting between Malcolm and the flight crew. Something in the older man's demeanor, the quiet confidence, the strategic patience, had triggered his instincts. This wasn't the typical passenger dispute. "Mr. Washington, perhaps you could explain your side," Karen began, but was interrupted by the sound of rapid footsteps from the terminal. A woman in her late 40s with a sleek bob and executive attire appeared, slightly out of breath and visibly distressed. "Diana Foster, Continental Airways chief operating officer, had arrived in record time, her face draining of color as she confirmed what the urgent call had suggested. "Mr. Washington," she gasped, horror dawning in her eyes. "I am so sorry about this. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew you were right, but had to deal with someone on a power trip? Comment 1 if you've experienced discrimination like Malcolm and Jamal. How would you have handled this situation? Would you have maintained Malcolm's calm, strategic approach, or would you have reacted differently? Like this video if you believe patience can sometimes be more powerful than immediate confrontation, and subscribe to see more stories of justice served in unexpected ways. What do you think is about to happen now that the COO has arrived? The next part will reveal the shocking truth about Malcolm Washington that will change everything for this flight crew. Diana Foster's unexpected appearance on the jet bridge created an immediate shift in the atmosphere. The Continental Airways COO smoothed her blazer and stepped forward with the urgency of someone attempting to contain a rapidly expanding disaster. "Mr. Washington, please accept my most profound apologies for this situation," she said, her voice steady despite her evident distress. "I came as soon as I received your call." Heather and Brett exchanged confused glances, clearly struggling to understand why the company's second-in-command had rushed to personally intervene in what they had treated as a routine passenger issue. "You know this passenger?" Brett asked tentatively. Diana turned to face the flight attendants, her professional composure barely masking her dismay. "Heather Bailey and Brett Coleman, correct?" Both nodded slowly. "Did either of you read this morning's company-wide memo?" Diana asked, her tone deceptively calm. "We've been on duty since 5 a.m., Brett explained. "I haven't had a chance to check company communications." "I saw there was an acquisition announcement," Heather added hesitantly, "but we were busy with pre-flight preparations." Diana closed her eyes briefly, as if gathering strength. The memo announced that Continental Airways has been acquired by Washington Aviation Group. Effective as of 9 a.m. this morning. She turned toward Malcolm. "This is Malcolm Washington, the CEO of Washington Aviation Group and our new owner." The revelation landed like a thunderclap on the jet bridge. Heather's face went from confusion to horror as the implications crashed over her. Brett took an instinctive step backward, his earlier confidence evaporating instantly. We didn't." Heather stammered, her complexion ashen. Troy, the security officer, unsuccessfully tried to suppress a small smile as he watched the scene unfold. Karen Mitchell, the ground supervisor, looked professionally mortified. "And this is his son, Jamal," Diana continued, nodding respectfully toward the teenager, who was also removed from his rightful first-class seat. Jamal, still processing this revelation himself, looked at his father with new understanding. "You bought the airline. When were you going to tell me?" "Surprise," Malcolm said with a small smile. "I was planning to explain during our trip. Part of the reason I wanted us to fly commercial was to experience the service firsthand." "And you certainly got an authentic experience," Diana said grimly. The jet bridge door opened, and Raymond Curtis emerged, phone in hand. "Excuse me," he said, addressing the group. "I couldn't help but overhear. I have video documentation of what transpired in the cabin, if that would be helpful." "And you are?" Diana asked. "Raymond Curtis, Executive VP at Meridian Financial. Frequent Continental flyer." He turned to Malcolm. "I couldn't stay seated after witnessing what happened to you and your son, sir." "That wasn't right." Malcolm nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Mr. Curtis. Your integrity is commendable." Heather, now visibly trembling, attempted damage control. "Mr. Washington, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. I would never intentionally discriminate against passengers based on their race." Malcolm finished for her. "And yet, that's precisely what happened, isn't it?" "I was just following protocol for verification," Heather insisted weakly. "Protocol that somehow only applied to the 2 black passengers in first class?" Malcolm asked calmly. Brett, recognizing the severity of the situation, wisely remained silent, though he had physically distanced himself from Heather as if to separate himself from her actions. "Ms. Foster," Malcolm addressed Diana, "I believe we need to have a conversation about Continental's culture and training procedures. This incident reflects systemic issues that require immediate attention." "Absolutely," Diana agreed without hesitation. "We can use the executive conference room. I've already asked our head of HR and general counsel to meet us there." Karen spoke up. "What about the flight? It's already delayed by 30 minutes. Diana checked her watch. "We'll need to rebook these passengers and issue an appropriate delay notification. Customer compensation protocols should be initiated." "That won't be necessary," Malcolm interjected. "I prefer the flight continue once we've resolved the immediate issue. I don't want other passengers inconvenienced further." Troy, who had been observing quietly, finally spoke. "Sir, for what it's worth, I apologize for being called to this situation. Some of us try to be better." Malcolm met the young security officer's gaze with understanding. "No apology necessary. You were doing your job. In fact, I'd like to speak with you later, if possible." As the group prepared to move toward the terminal, the jet bridge door opened again. A flight attendant Malcolm hadn't seen before poked her head out. "Brett, the captain wants to know what's," she stopped abruptly, recognizing Diana. "Ms. Foster. I didn't expect to see you here." "Andrea," Diana acknowledged her. "Please inform Captain Richards that there's been a situation involving our new CEO. The flight will continue shortly, but we'll need to make some staff adjustments." Andrea's eyes widened as she registered the implications, glancing between Diana and the Washingtons. "Yes, ma'am. Right away." As Andrea disappeared back into the aircraft, Raymond approached Malcolm. "Mr. Washington, I've been flying Continental for years and have noticed similar patterns of treatment toward minority passengers in premium cabins. If you're conducting any sort of review, I'd be willing to share my observations." "I would appreciate that greatly, Mr. Curtis," Malcolm replied, handing him a business card. "My acquisition of Continental was partly motivated by reports of such incidents. Experiencing it firsthand has only reinforced my commitment to transformation." Jamal, who had maintained remarkable composure throughout the ordeal, finally spoke up. "Dad, you always taught me to turn obstacles into opportunities. Is that what's happening here?" Malcolm placed his hand on his son's shoulder. "Exactly, Jamal. This is why patience and strategy are more powerful than immediate reaction. Now we have the opportunity to create systemic change rather than just address a single incident." As they began walking toward the terminal, Malcolm noticed Heather hanging back, visibly shaken and uncertain about her future. Despite everything, he felt no satisfaction in her distress. The goal had never been punishment, but transformation, not just for Heather or Continental Airways, but for an industry where such incidents remained far too common. "Ms. Bailey," he called to her. "I'll expect you at the meeting as well." Heather looked up, surprise replacing fear. She had clearly expected immediate termination. "Your perspective will be essential to understanding how these biases operate," Malcolm explained. "Real change requires honest reflection, not just punitive action." As they entered the terminal, the full weight of the situation continued to unfold around them. What had begun as a routine flight had transformed into a pivotal moment, not just for Malcolm and Jamal Washington, but for Continental Airways and perhaps the aviation industry itself. The executive conference room on the airport's mezzanine level hummed with tense energy. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the tarmac where Flight 1387 remained parked at Gate A17, its passengers increasingly restless as the delay extended past the hour mark. Malcolm and Jamal sat on one side of the polished mahogany table. Across from them were Diana Foster and Greg Phillips, Continental's 51-year-old general counsel whose hurried arrival had left his typically impeccable appearance slightly disheveled. Heather occupied a chair at the far end, physically separate from both groups, a visual representation of her precarious position. I've instructed the flight to continue without Ms. Bailey, Diana began after introductions were complete. Brett Coleman will complete his duties on this flight, but I've scheduled him for administrative leave pending investigation. Andrea Morales will serve as the lead flight attendant for the remainder of the journey. Greg Phillips cleared his throat. Before we proceed, Mr. Washington, I want to express that Continental Airways has a zero-tolerance policy for discrimination. This incident clearly failed to meet our standards, and we're prepared to take immediate corrective action. Malcolm nodded. I appreciate that sentiment, Mr. Phillips, but I'm more interested in systemic solutions than individual punishments. He opened a slim leather portfolio he'd retrieved from his carry-on bag, removing several documents. Over the past 6 months, Washington Aviation Group has been monitoring customer complaints across several airlines, including Continental. We've documented 47 incidents involving discriminatory treatment of minority passengers in premium cabins on Continental flights alone. Greg's professional composure faltered momentarily. 47. Yes, Malcolm confirmed. Predominantly involving Black and Latino passengers, with a notable concentration of incidents on transcontinental and international routes. Diana's expression grew increasingly troubled. I was aware of some complaints, but not to this extent. That's part of the problem, Malcolm explained. Individual incidents are addressed in isolation, without recognition of the pattern. When I experienced similar treatment as a passenger last year, it prompted me to look more closely at Continental's operations. That's why you acquired us, Diana realized aloud. It was one factor among many, Malcolm acknowledged. Continental has excellent routes, a strong fleet, and loyal customers. But its approach to diversity and inclusion lags significantly behind industry standards. Greg Phillips, ever the attorney, attempted to regain control of the narrative. While we take these allegations seriously, Mr. Washington, isolated incidents don't necessarily indicate systemic. I have the data, Mr. Phillips, Malcolm interrupted firmly. Quantitative and qualitative. I'm not here to litigate the existence of the problem, but to fix it. Jamal, who had been quietly observing the exchange, spoke up. What happened to us today isn't just about bad customer service. It's about assumptions and biases that affect how people like my dad and me are treated every day, no matter how successful we are. The room fell silent as the teenager's words landed with profound simplicity. You're absolutely right, Jamal, Diana agreed. And I want you to know how deeply sorry I am that this happened. Apologies are important, Malcolm acknowledged, but insufficient. Continental needs comprehensive structural changes. He turned to Heather, who had remained silent, her eyes downcast. Ms. Bailey, how long have you worked for Continental? Startled at being addressed directly, she looked up. 15 years, sir. In those 15 years, did you ever receive substantive training on unconscious bias or cultural sensitivity? Heather hesitated before answering truthfully. We had a 2-hour diversity workshop during initial training. And occasional online refreshers during annual certification. So minimal, checkbox-style training, Malcolm clarified. Yes, Heather admitted. It's never been emphasized as a priority. Malcolm turned back to Diana and Greg. My conditions for resolving this situation are as follows. First, Continental will implement a comprehensive anti-bias training program for all customer-facing staff, developed in consultation with leading experts in the field. Diana nodded. That's reasonable and necessary. Second, the company will establish an independent review board to assess discrimination complaints, with quarterly reports provided directly to the CEO and board of directors. Greg made notes but looked less comfortable with this stipulation. That would require significant structural changes. Third, Malcolm continued, Continental will create a scholarship program for minority students interested in aviation careers, with specific emphasis on management and leadership tracks. That's actually a wonderful idea, Diana commented. It would help address the pipeline issue we've discussed at leadership meetings. Finally, Malcolm concluded, the company will conduct a top-to-bottom review of all customer service protocols to identify and eliminate practices that enable discriminatory treatment. Greg Phillips set down his pen. While these initiatives are commendable, Mr. Washington, I must point out the potential financial implications. The training alone would be a significant expenditure. The financial implications of not addressing these issues are far greater, Malcolm countered. Consider the reputational damage and potential litigation from incidents like today's. Now imagine if Mr. Curtis's video were to go viral. The attorney paled slightly at the mention of video evidence. I'm not interested in public shaming or viral outrage, Malcolm clarified. I acquired Continental because I believe in its potential. But that potential can only be realized if we address these fundamental issues. Jamal leaned forward. If I could make a suggestion. All eyes turned to the teenager. The training shouldn't just be about what not to do, he offered thoughtfully. It should help staff understand how it feels to be on the receiving end of these assumptions and behaviors. Maybe include perspectives from passengers who've experienced discrimination. Diana looked impressed. That's an excellent point, Jamal. Experiential learning tends to be more effective than purely academic approaches. Malcolm smiled proudly at his son before addressing Heather. Which brings me to you, Ms. Bailey. Heather straightened in her chair, visibly bracing for termination. Yes, sir. Your actions today were discriminatory and harmful, Malcolm stated plainly. But I don't believe firing you solves the underlying problem. Confusion crossed her face. I don't understand. I'm offering you a choice, Malcolm explained. You can resign immediately, or you can become part of creating the solution by helping develop our new training program. You want my input? Heather asked incredulously. I want your perspective, Malcolm clarified. Understanding the thought processes that led to your actions today is crucial to developing effective training. Your 15 years of experience give you insights that outside consultants lack. Greg Phillips looked skeptical. Mr. Washington, while I appreciate your approach, there are liability concerns with retaining an employee after a documented discrimination incident. I'm aware of the legal implications, Malcolm replied. But I believe transformation is more valuable than termination in this case. Diana turned to Heather. This is an extraordinary opportunity, Heather. One most companies wouldn't offer. Heather looked between them, still processing this unexpected turn. Why would you trust me to help fix a problem I was part of creating? Because recognizing your role in the problem is the first step toward becoming part of the solution, Malcolm answered. Sometimes, those who've caused harm have the greatest motivation to prevent it in the future. The room fell silent as the weight of the decision hung in the air. Outside, Flight 1387 finally began pushing back from the gate, nearly 90 minutes behind schedule. The immediate crisis was ending, but the real work was just beginning. Before you decide, Ms. Bailey, Malcolm added, I want to be clear that this isn't charity or forgiveness. It's a business decision based on the belief that your experience, properly channeled, can help create meaningful change. It will require humility, honesty, and hard work. Heather took a deep breath. I would like to accept your offer, Mr. Washington. I never saw myself as someone who discriminates. Facing that truth is painful, but necessary. Malcolm nodded, recognizing her first step toward genuine accountability. Good. Diana will coordinate the details of your reassignment. As the meeting continued into the specifics of implementation timelines and resource allocation, a knock at the conference room door interrupted their discussion. Raymond Curtis stood in the doorway. Sorry to interrupt, he said. I wanted to let you know I've declined my seat on the flight. I thought my time might be better spent here, if you're interested in my observations as a frequent flyer. Malcolm gestured to an empty chair. We would value your input, Mr. Curtis. Please join us. As Raymond settled in, Malcolm reflected on how a routine flight had transformed into something much more significant. What had begun as a humiliating experience for him and his son was evolving into an opportunity for institutional change, proving once again that strategic patience could transform obstacles into opportunities. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the conference room as the meeting entered its third hour. Coffee cups and water bottles littered the table, evidence of the intense, ongoing discussions about Continental's future. "I think that covers the immediate action items," Diana Foster concluded, reviewing her extensive notes. "We'll reconvene tomorrow with the full executive team to begin implementation." Malcolm nodded in agreement. "Thank you, Diana. I'd like a few minutes alone with Ms. Bailey before we finish." As the others filed out of the room, Heather remained seated, hands clasped tightly on the table. The confident flight attendant from earlier had been replaced by someone visibly confronting uncomfortable truths about herself. When the door closed, Malcolm spoke directly. "Ms. Bailey, I want to understand something. When you approached my son and me on that aircraft, what did you see?" Heather shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Be honest," Malcolm encouraged. "Not what you think I want to hear, but what actually went through your mind." After a long pause, Heather replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw two people who didn't fit my mental image of first-class passengers." "And what does a first-class passenger look like in your mind?" "I guess, business attire. Certain brands. Usually older." She hesitated. "Usually white." Malcolm nodded, appreciating her candor. "And when we presented valid boarding passes?" "I assumed there must be some mistake," she admitted. "I thought maybe you'd been upgraded by a gate agent who felt sorry for you, or there was a computer error. Because it seemed more plausible that the system had failed than that we belonged there legitimately." Heather's eyes welled with tears. "Yes. And hearing it said out loud. I'm truly ashamed." Malcolm leaned forward. "That shame is appropriate, but it's not the end point. It's the beginning of growth. What you did caused real harm, Ms. Bailey. I want you to hear directly from Jamal how it affected him." He texted briefly, and moments later, Jamal entered the room, his expression serious as he took a seat beside his father. "Jamal, would you be willing to share with Ms. Bailey how today's experience made you feel?" The teenager collected his thoughts before speaking. "It was humiliating," he began, his voice steady despite the emotion behind his words. "I've worked really hard at school, followed all the rules, done everything right. But none of that mattered. You took one look at me and decided I didn't belong." Heather winced but maintained eye contact. "The worst part wasn't even what you did," Jamal continued. "It was watching all those other passengers just sit there. A few looked uncomfortable, but nobody except Mr. Curtis said anything. Everyone just accepted that we should be removed, and that hurt more than anything you said." "I'm truly sorry," Heather responded, her voice breaking. "There's no excuse for how I treated you." "You're right, there isn't," Jamal agreed. "But my dad always says that acknowledging a mistake is the first step toward fixing it." Malcolm watched the exchange with pride. His son's composure and articulate expression of his experience reflected a maturity beyond his 16 years, maturity partially forged through navigating situations exactly like this one. "Ms. Bailey," Malcolm said, "what you're experiencing now, this discomfort, this recognition of harm caused, is exactly what needs to be central to our training program. Not abstract concepts, but real human impact." Heather nodded slowly. "I understand now. And I want to be part of making sure others don't have to experience what Jamal did today." "That's a start," Malcolm acknowledged. "Beginning tomorrow, you'll be reassigned to our training development team. You'll work directly with our diversity consultants to document exactly what happened today and help analyze where the breakdowns occurred." "What about my regular flights?" Heather asked. "You'll be on administrative assignment for the next 6 months, focusing solely on this project," Malcolm explained. "Your compensation will remain the same, but your responsibilities will change significantly." As Malcolm outlined the specifics of her new role, Heather's expression shifted from resignation to cautious engagement. The path forward would be difficult, but also offered an unexpected opportunity for growth. "There's something else you should know," Malcolm added, sliding a folder across the table. "This contains passenger complaint data specifically related to your flights over the past 5 years." Heather opened the folder hesitantly. Inside were 12 formal complaints from minority passengers alleging discriminatory treatment. Her face paled as she flipped through the documents. "I don't remember most of these incidents," she admitted. "That's part of the problem," Malcolm noted. "These incidents were significant enough for passengers to file formal complaints, yet they weren't memorable to you. That suggests the behaviors were so normalized in your mind that you didn't even register them as problematic." The realization visibly shook her. "I never thought of myself as prejudiced." "Few people do," Malcolm replied. "But unconscious bias doesn't require conscious prejudice. It operates below the surface, influencing decisions and behaviors in ways we don't recognize without deliberate self-examination." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Raymond Curtis entered, looking somewhat apologetic. "Sorry to interrupt. Diana asked me to let you know they're ready for the next steps whenever you are." He held up his phone. "Also, I've been thinking about the video I captured today." Malcolm raised an eyebrow. "And?" "I'm deleting it," Raymond decided. "Not to protect Continental or Ms. Bailey, but because I believe your approach will be more effective than public shaming could ever be." Malcolm nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Mr. Curtis. Your integrity continues to impress me." As Raymond left, Heather looked up from the complaint file. "Those passengers, they must have felt just like Jamal did today. And I never even realized what I was doing." "That recognition is valuable," Malcolm acknowledged. "Now the question is, what will you do with it?" Before she could respond, there was another knock. Troy Wilson, the security officer, appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Washington. Ms. Foster mentioned you wanted to speak with me before you left the airport." "Yes, please join us, Mr. Wilson." Malcolm gestured to an empty chair. "I wanted to thank you for your professionalism earlier and discuss something with you." Troy sat down, still in his security uniform but noticeably more relaxed than during their jet bridge encounter. "No thanks necessary, sir. I was just doing my job." "You did more than that," Malcolm observed. "You assessed the situation objectively rather than making assumptions. That's unfortunately rare." Troy glanced briefly at Heather before responding. "In my position, I see how quickly situations can escalate when assumptions drive actions. I try to observe first, act second. That's exactly the mindset we need to cultivate throughout Continental," Malcolm said. "Which is why I'd like to offer you a position on our training development team alongside Ms. Bailey." Troy looked surprised. "Sir. Your perspective as a security officer who regularly navigates complex passenger situations would be invaluable. Plus, your background in law enforcement training gives you insight into how procedural changes can impact behavioral outcomes." "I appreciate the offer," Troy replied, "but I'm not sure how qualified I am for corporate training development." "You're uniquely qualified precisely because you're not entrenched in corporate thinking," Malcolm explained. "You bring a fresh perspective grounded in real-world experience." As Malcolm outlined the potential role, Troy's initial hesitation gave way to genuine interest. By the end of their conversation, both Troy and Heather had agreed to join the training initiative, two people from opposite sides of the day's incident now united in working toward prevention of similar situations. As they prepared to leave, Malcolm reflected on how a single flight had catalyzed changes that would potentially impact thousands of future passengers and employees. What had begun as discrimination had transformed into an unexpected opportunity for institutional growth. "Dad," Jamal said as they gathered their belongings, "I think I understand now why you bought this airline." Malcolm smiled. Sometimes the most effective way to change a system is from within. Today was difficult, but necessary. And the real work is just beginning. 6 months later, Malcolm Washington stood at the podium in Continental Airways corporate headquarters auditorium, addressing 500 employees gathered for the official launch of the company's Inclusive Excellence Initiative. Behind him, a digital screen displayed the new program logo, a stylized aircraft surrounded by diverse silhouettes. "Today marks not an endpoint, but a beginning," Malcolm stated, his voice carrying clearly through the packed room. 6 months ago, an incident occurred that revealed deep-seated issues within our organization. Today, we unveil the comprehensive response developed through the collaborative efforts of executives, frontline staff, and outside experts. In the front row, Jamal sat alongside Diana Foster and the core development team, including Heather Bailey and Troy Wilson. The past half-year had transformed them from adversaries into colleagues united by a common purpose. "The numbers tell a compelling story," Malcolm continued, gesturing toward the screen as it shifted to display statistics. "Since implementing our pilot training program 3 months ago, customer complaints related to discriminatory treatment have decreased by 62%. Employee satisfaction scores have increased by 28%. And our Net Promoter Score has reached its highest level in 5 years." Murmurs of approval rippled through the audience. "But statistics only tell part of the story," Malcolm emphasized. "The real transformation is happening in daily interactions, in moment-by-moment decisions that honor the dignity of every passenger and employee." He gestured toward Heather, who rose and joined him at the podium. The former flight attendant looked markedly different, not just in her business attire replacing the familiar uniform, but in her demeanor. The defensive posture and tight smile had given way to authentic confidence. "6 months ago, I was at the center of an incident that initially filled me with shame," Heather began candidly. "I had to confront the uncomfortable truth that my actions, whether conscious or not, caused real harm. That recognition was painful but necessary." Her gaze swept across the audience of her former colleagues. "What I've learned through this process is that bias isn't just about bad people making bad decisions. It's about good people making unconscious assumptions that have harmful impacts despite our intentions." The audience listened intently as Heather detailed her journey from defensive denial to genuine understanding. She described the hundreds of hours spent analyzing complaint data, interviewing affected passengers, and working with experts to dissect the psychological mechanisms behind discriminatory behaviors. "The training program you'll experience isn't about blame or guilt," she explained. "It's about awareness and action. It provides practical tools to recognize and interrupt bias before it affects our interactions with each other and our passengers." As Heather concluded her remarks, Troy Wilson joined them at the podium, now wearing the business casual attire of his new role as security training liaison. "My perspective comes from both sides of this issue," Troy began. "As a black man, I've experienced the subtle and not-so-subtle ways bias manifests in everyday interactions. As a former security officer, I've seen how systems can either amplify or mitigate those biases." He outlined the security protocol revisions implemented across Continental's network, designed to ensure objective assessment of situations rather than reactive responses based on stereotypes. "The changes we've made aren't just about avoiding negative incidents," Troy emphasized. "They're about creating positive experiences for all passengers and staff, regardless of background." The presentation continued with Diana Foster introducing the newly established Jamal Washington Aviation Scholarship, named in honor of the teenager whose dignified response to discrimination had helped catalyze organizational change. This scholarship will provide full financial support and mentorship to 10 minority students annually who are pursuing careers in aviation, Diana announced. "We're proud to share that our first class of scholars has already been selected and will begin their journey with Continental this fall." Jamal rose to unexpected applause, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and pride as he briefly acknowledged the honor. As the formal presentation concluded, Malcolm invited a special guest to join them. Raymond Curtis, the passenger who had witnessed the original incident, stepped forward. "6 months ago, I observed discrimination in action and felt compelled to document it," Raymond shared. "Today, I'm here as Continental's newest board advisor for customer experience, helping ensure these positive changes become permanently embedded in the company's culture." He described how his initial video documentation, which he ultimately deleted, had evolved into constructive engagement with Continental's transformation efforts. "What impressed me most was Mr. Washington's approach," Raymond explained. "Rather than pursuing public shaming or punitive measures, he chose systematic, sustainable change. That's leadership in action." The formal event transitioned into a networking reception where employees explored interactive exhibits demonstrating the new training modules. Malcolm observed with satisfaction as flight attendants, gate agents, and operations staff engaged earnestly with the materials. Across the room, he noticed Heather and Troy deep in conversation with a group of newly hired flight attendants, their animated gestures suggesting passionate discussion. The sight affirmed his belief in transformation over termination. Heather had indeed become one of the most effective advocates for change precisely because she had experienced her own painful awakening. Diana joined him, champagne flute in hand. "The industry is taking notice, Malcolm. 3 other major airlines have reached out about licensing our training program." "Good," Malcolm replied. "This was never just about Continental. It's about raising the standard across the entire industry." Speaking of industry impact, Diana added, "Have you seen the latest satisfaction numbers? We're outperforming competitors in premium cabin experience for the first time in a decade. Turns out treating people with dignity is actually good business." Malcolm smiled. "Imagine that." As the event continued, Jamal approached his father. "That scholarship thing was a surprise," he said, clearly still processing the honor. "It was Diana's idea," Malcolm explained. "Though I fully endorsed it." "Your response that day showed exceptional character, Jamal. That deserves recognition." "I was just following your example," Jamal replied. "Play the long game, right?" "Right," Malcolm agreed, pride evident in his voice. "And speaking of the long game, I understand you've been spending time with the engineering team during school breaks?" Jamal nodded. "I'm thinking aviation might actually be in my future. Not just the business side, but the technical aspects too." "Whatever path you choose, I'm proud of you," Malcolm assured him. "You've already contributed to meaningful change in this industry, and you're just getting started." As father and son surveyed the room full of engaged employees, they witnessed the tangible manifestation of Malcolm's long-held philosophy: true power wasn't found in retaliation or public humiliation, but in strategic patience and systematic transformation. What had begun as a discriminatory incident on a routine flight had catalyzed changes affecting thousands of employees and millions of passengers. The long game, as always, had proven worth playing. 1 year to the day after the incident that changed Continental Airways, Malcolm and Jamal Washington boarded Flight 1387 from Boston to Atlanta. The symmetry was intentional. Malcolm had specifically arranged their travel schedule to mirror the journey that had catalyzed such profound organizational transformation. This time, however, the experience proved markedly different from the moment they entered the terminal. The Continental Airways check-in agent greeted them with genuine warmth, not the perfunctory politeness often reserved for premium passengers. Malcolm noted with satisfaction that she maintained the same attentive service for the economy passengers ahead of them in line. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Washington," Jamal, the gate agent greeted them as they approached the jet bridge. "It's an honor to have you with us today." Unlike the previous year, Malcolm made no attempt to travel incognito. After 12 months of company-wide training and cultural shift, he wanted to evaluate the authentic experience, not test for discriminatory treatment. As they settled into their first-class seats, 2A and 2B, the same as before, Malcolm noted the subtle changes in the cabin environment. The premium service elements remained, but with a noticeable shift in atmosphere. Flight attendants moved through the cabin with the same efficiency but demonstrated more consistent attentiveness across all passengers. "Mr. Washington, Jamal, welcome aboard," said Andrea Morales, now the customer experience manager for Continental's premium cabins. "It's wonderful to see you both. May I get you something to drink before takeoff?" After they placed their orders, Jamal leaned toward his father. "It's weird being recognized everywhere we go on the airline now. The price of success," Malcolm replied with a small smile. Though I suspect the recognition has more to do with the company-wide impact than my ownership position. The Washingtons had indeed become known throughout Continental. Jamal's scholarship program had expanded to 15 recipients in its first year, with plans to reach 25 by the following term. Malcolm's philosophy of strategic response to discrimination had been incorporated into the company's training materials, complete with anonymized case studies based on their experience. As pre-flight service continued, Malcolm observed a remarkable moment. Heather Bailey emerged from the galley, now wearing the distinctive blazer that identified her as part of the training and development team rather than a flight attendant uniform. She approached their seats with composed confidence. "Good morning, Mr. Washington, Jamal. I hope you don't mind my presence on this flight. I'm conducting a training observation today." "Not at all," Malcolm replied. "How's the regional implementation progressing?" "We're at 92% completion," Heather reported. "The remaining stations will be fully trained by month's end." Jamal studied her with curiosity. "Do you miss flying?" Heather considered the question thoughtfully. "Sometimes. But this work is more meaningful than I ever imagined. Watching staff apply the training and seeing the positive passenger responses, it's incredibly rewarding." Their conversation was interrupted by a familiar voice from across the aisle. "Well, if it isn't the Washington family." Raymond Curtis settled into seat 2C, extending his hand to Malcolm. "Fancy meeting you here." "Mr. Curtis," Malcolm greeted him warmly. "Still conducting your quarterly audit?" Since joining Continental's advisory board, Raymond had instituted a practice of quarterly experience audits, unannounced flights where he evaluated service standards and implementation of the new protocols. "Someone has to keep you honest," Raymond replied with good humor. "Though I'm pleased to report this route has maintained exemplary ratings for 3 consecutive quarters." As the flight prepared for departure, Malcolm reflected on the year's journey. Continental Airways had transformed from an acquisition target with problematic practices into an industry leader in inclusive excellence. The training program developed in response to their incident had been licensed to 2 other major airlines and was under consideration by several international carriers. Most significantly, passenger data revealed that the improvements in service consistency had translated to measurable business success. Customer loyalty among minority passengers had increased by 47%, and overall customer satisfaction scores had reached record highs across all demographic groups. "You know what I realized, Dad?" Jamal said as the aircraft began its taxi. "What happened to us that day, it was awful, but so many good things came from it." "That's the paradox of adversity," Malcolm replied. "Handled correctly, it becomes opportunity." The flight proceeded smoothly, with the crew demonstrating the consistent, respectful service that had become Continental's new standard. As they began their descent into Atlanta, Malcolm reflected on the journey, not just the physical travel from Boston, but the organizational transformation triggered by discrimination confronted with strategic patience rather than reactive anger. After landing, as passengers prepared to deplane, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we arrive at the gate, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of someone special on our flight today. 1 year ago, an incident on this very route led to significant changes in how we serve our passengers. Today, Continental Airways ranks first in customer satisfaction across all major U.S. carriers. Much of that transformation is due to the leadership and vision of our owner and CEO, Malcolm Washington, who is with us today. Sir, on behalf of the entire Continental family, thank you for showing us a better way forward." Spontaneous applause broke out among the passengers and crew. Malcolm acknowledged it with a modest nod, uncomfortable with personal recognition but grateful for the evidence of genuine cultural change. As they exited the aircraft, Heather fell into step beside them in the jet bridge. "There's something I've wanted to tell you both," she said, her professional demeanor momentarily giving way to genuine emotion. "That day last year was the worst of my professional life, but ultimately the most important. You had every right to demand my termination, to publicly shame me, to make an example of what happens when bias affects service. Instead, you offered an opportunity for growth and change, not just for me, but for an entire organization. She turned specifically to Jamal. I think about you every time I conduct training. About how it felt for you that day, and about how many other passengers must have felt similarly because of actions I never even recognized as harmful. You've changed how I see the world, and I'm deeply grateful for that education, painful though it was. Jamal, now 17 and nearly graduated from Westbrook Academy, extended his hand. Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who learn alongside their students. As they parted ways in the terminal, Malcolm spotted Troy Wilson waiting near baggage claim. The former security officer had recently been promoted to Director of Security Training for Continental's entire eastern region. Mr. Washington, Jamal, welcome to Atlanta, Troy greeted them. I've taken the liberty of arranging transportation to your hotel. Thank you, Troy, but that wasn't necessary, Malcolm replied. Actually, it was, Troy countered with a smile. The executive team is waiting to surprise you with an anniversary celebration. I was sent to ensure you don't slip away to work instead. Malcolm laughed. Caught red-handed. Lead the way. As they followed Troy through the terminal, Jamal observed, it's kind of amazing, isn't it? How different things are from a year ago. It is, Malcolm agreed. But that's the nature of true power. It's not about winning a single confrontation or punishing a single wrong. It's about transforming systems so the same wrongs don't keep happening. The long game, Jamal nodded, echoing his father's longtime philosophy. Exactly, Malcolm confirmed. And we're still playing it. As they exited the terminal into the bright Atlanta sunshine, the contrast couldn't have been clearer. What had begun as a humiliating removal from first class had evolved into industry-leading change. The patience and strategic thinking that had initially appeared as passivity had ultimately proven more powerful than any immediate reaction could have been. Malcolm Washington had not just purchased an airline, he had transformed it. And in doing so, he had demonstrated a profound truth about confronting discrimination. Sometimes the most effective response isn't the most obvious one. Sometimes patience truly is more powerful than anger. Have you ever experienced a situation where strategic patience proved more effective than immediate reaction? Share your story in the comments below. If you found value in Malcolm's approach to transforming obstacles into opportunities, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of resilience and wisdom. Remember to share this video with someone who might need encouragement in facing discrimination or adversity with dignity and strategic thinking. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and may you transform your own obstacles into meaningful change. Malcolm Washington's experience teaches us that strategic patience can be more powerful than immediate confrontation when facing discrimination. By remaining calm and calculating his response rather than reacting angrily, Malcolm transformed a humiliating incident into an opportunity for systemic change. His approach demonstrates that true power isn't about winning individual battles but creating lasting transformation. The story also highlights how unconscious bias operates beneath the surface of our interactions. Heather's discrimination wasn't born of conscious hatred but unexamined assumptions about who belongs in premium spaces. By addressing the root causes rather than simply punishing individuals, Malcolm created meaningful change that benefited countless others. Perhaps most importantly, Malcolm showed his son Jamal that dignity cannot be taken, only surrendered. By maintaining composure in the face of injustice, he demonstrated how to transform obstacles into opportunities while preserving self-respect. This long game approach ultimately proved more effective than any immediate reaction could have been. Have you ever faced discrimination and had to decide between immediate reaction or strategic patience? Share your experience in the comments below. If Malcolm's approach resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about overcoming adversity with dignity and wisdom. How would you have handled this situation if you were in Malcolm's position? Would you have revealed your identity immediately, or played the long game like he did? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for joining us for this powerful story about transforming discrimination into positive change. Share this video with someone who might need encouragement in facing adversity with strategic thinking and patience. Remember, sometimes your greatest power lies in how you respond to injustice.